My interest in classicism doesn't come out just because it's classical, but because classicism is about a delight and a beauty and a proportion and a harmony which you don't necessarily find in many contemporary buildings. So I thought this would be a good way, though, to recognize and then encourage more better built buildings.
I think the Driehaus Prize is particularly interesting because not only do we award individual achievements, but also how these individual achievements bring something to a reconstruction of the métier, of the craft, of the art of making towns and buildings.
In a very beautiful way, our jury has selected each laureate with an understanding of a longer-term trajectory, almost like a constellation in the sky that's incomplete, and that each laureate fills in that constellation. And rather than seeing the sequencing of our laureates, it's really about painting a larger view of the world.
Nobody created anything new or invented anything out of a vacuum. So the classical is the precedent. But we do not really look at that in order to copy it, in order to perpetuate it. No. We look at that as a background, as a precedent against which we create something new. This is exactly what I find to be fantastically important in this idea of the classical.
Classical architecture is an architecture that is learning from its past, that builds on an empirical understanding of what is pleasing in terms of dimensions and proportions and components of buildings.
Whether it's urban planning or teaching or making architecture, it's all a part of this same sense of the humanistic code as it's revealed in 3 dimensions in the work.
Tradition is not static, but it's like a tree, it's growing. It is more a handing down of knowledge, experience, and passing it through another generation.
Classicism, in its essence, refers to traditional construction, meaning the use of natural materials. Virtually everything you see in the language of building, classicism, is a language of construction.
We can't just tack a classical grid onto a steel frame and call it classical architecture. The classical architecture that we admire in Rome, Paris, London, lasts for centuries, whereas modern architecture lasts for a few decades.
Classical architecture enables you to design buildings that are contextual, buildings that relate very visibly to different climates and to different cultures.
What classicism provides the architect, and particularly the educator, is something teachable. You can very early on in your career, as Notre Dame demonstrates, you can have very, very competent kids, because classical architecture is a system. It's also a system that guarantees a certain base, below which you don't fall. It's capable of great things, but it also prevents you from falling. Nothing else can say that. Modernism never provides a bottom. It's capable of great masterpieces, but since it doesn't provide a series of systems or rules, you fall right through and there is, in fact, no bottom. There's 30 million modernist buildings to prove that.
Cuando se produce una gran confusión es cuando el clasicismo puede aparecer ahí como un áncora de salvación, un lugar a donde agarrarse en un último extremo, en un momento en el cual no sabemos por dónde salir. Ahí está el clasicismo con sus formas puras, con sus formas elementales, siempre dispuesto a salvar la arquitectura del futuro con la luz de la del pasado.
Classical architecture is obviously a language, but it's more than just a language of form, because it's anthropomorphic. And classical forms cannot be separated from this anthropocentric root.
What the classical language has said over time and can still say in the future needs to be foregrounded. It has been pushed to the side in the last 100 years. The issue is, crucially, can one be modern and classical at the same time? I say yes.
I'm probably the person on the jury who has the greatest sympathy for modernism when it works. But even as somebody who has a lot of modernist sympathies, I'm the first to admit that modernism has failed terribly in creating an urbanism, in creating a vernacular, in creating a language out of which we might build ordinary places as well as special places. The prize really focuses on what impact can traditional architecture have in the contemporary world. So in that way, it's as much a prize about the 21st century as about anything else. One of the great things that Notre Dame and Michael Lykoudis have done in administering the prize is to broaden its focus while still being completely true to the values and motivations that were behind Richard Driehaus's decision to create the prize. It's about not just loving classicism and not just loving traditional architecture, but making them meaningful in contemporary life. That's really what this prize honors.
I think this prize was a huge help to all of those who wanted to work in that idiom and weren't getting much public encouragement for it, let's say. It also encourages the shining of the light on many other parts of the world where their own form of classicism, which may look a little different but have some of the same principles, survives.
Usually, architecture is the footprint of a culture. It talks about the culture. You want to know who we are? Look at our history, look at our architecture, and you'll see our footprint in it, our signature. And this is important because you can see through the architecture what goes in the human ethos of the time.
Of all prizes in architecture that I'm familiar with, it is the only prize that celebrates an ideal.
The people who are honored by the Driehaus Prize have all a thinking which goes beyond their own work, but how their own work sits in much wider social and artistic fabric. I think that's really the relevant thing, that they are interested in making good buildings in a certain environment, but above all to save a language. I think that's the main thing, because we're like the last Mohicans trying to save some values which is overriding, which is more important than individual buildings or individual works.
Richard got it right. He said, I want people who can design traditional buildings that are contemporary, that meet all the requirements of contemporary life, and that carry forward this continuum, this language, inherited language.
Fashions come and go, but the stuff that we are trying to honor and celebrate will be with us forever. So to a great degree, we're part of this protest in favor of the humanist tradition and against the mindlessness of modern life that does seem to keep us from truly knowing who we are.
I think through looking at where we've been and knowing what our architectural history and traditions are really helps us to forge a future that is much more in keeping with our values.
The revival of the classical today is very relevant and important because beyond issues of taste, beyond issues of fashion and all of that, we are facing really fundamental problems and fundamental challenges today. And I'm referring really specifically to the ecological challenges. And the only architecture and the only urbanism that I can see being sustainable are classical architecture, or more generally traditional architecture, and traditional urbanism.
I think the elements of classicism and the opportunity to continue developing the classical language is important today, precisely because it represents our history. It represents the history of a culture, of a civilization, and recognizing the continuity of that is, in fact, a humble thing to do.
We don't want to lose those essential truths of classicism and the essential reasons of why it worked for so long. A great building should last for 100 years and could last for 200 or 300 years or longer. So I want architecture to strive for eternity, and I'm going to try to make that happen.